Hello, everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Prof. Jeffrey Sachs Fan World. And here is today's content. Iran's gathering day zero in Tehran is more than an urban infrastructure failure. It is a national security inflection point that rearranges power inside the state and recalibrates risk across the region. When taps run dry in a metropolis of nearly 10 million, politics ceases to be a contest of ideology and becomes a contest of provision. The state that cannot deliver water will struggle to deliver legitimacy. In this sense, hydrology becomes grand strategy. The drivers are cumulative and mutually reinforcing multi-year drought and rising temperatures, over extraction of aquifers, sedimented dams and aging pipes, electricity volatility that interrupts pumping, and an urban demand curve shaped by demographic pressure and rural to urban migration. Each component is manageable in isolation. Together, they produce systemic scarcity, short, unannounced rationing cycles, pressure loss in high-rise districts, sanitation stress, and knock-on effects in hospitals, food processing, and transit. Scarcity monetizes instantly, water trucking spreads, prices spike at the margins, and a gray market emerges that punishes the poor. This stress reframes Iran's internal political economy. The presidency, technocratic ministries, and the IRGC-centered security apparatus must decide day by day who gets water, power, diesel, and police protection. Allocation becomes politics. Channels that move scarce water towards strategic facilities, refineries, power plants, select industrial clusters inevitably move it away from households, clinics, and small firms. Every such diversion spends political capital. The bureaucracy therefore turns to three levers: one, targeted subsidies for low-income neighborhoods; two, emergency imports of pumps, membranes, and diesel for backup generation; three, coercive crowd management around distribution nodes. None is the solution. All are time-buying devices. Macroeconomically, day zero imposes a triple tax. First, a productivity tax. Interrupted shifts and spoiled inventories raise unit costs. Second, an inflation tax. Higher logistics and food prices propagate through markets, reinforcing already elevated expectations. Third, a credibility tax. Households and firms start hedging against state failure, installing private tanks, generators, and wells, fragmenting what remains of coordinated provision. The sum is, crucially, water scarcity also functions as a shadow regulator of the nuclear program and other strategic industries. A modern fuel cycle depends on uninterrupted electricity, cooling capacity at associated facilities, chemical inputs, and transport reliability for specialized parts. Hydro stress makes the grid jerky. Jerky grids make precision processes harder to sustain. Even if top priority sites are buffered with diesel and redundancies, the act of protecting them is visible to the public tankers and security cordons around facilities, while households queue at standpipes is the image that converts technical triage into political grievance. Internationally, a thirsty capital weakens Tehran's bargaining posture. The government must choose between spending scarce foreign exchange on resilience, desal membranes, pumps, food staples, or on prestige strategic programs, regional patronage. Each drought week narrows the menu of feasible choices. Monitoring bodies can, in this context, press for safety and stability, access on humanitarian grounds, reframing inspections as risk reduction rather than punishment. Conversely, hardline voices at home may argue that crisis justifies exceptional secrecy, raising misperception risks with neighbors and great powers alike. Finally, day zero changes the emotional geometry of the street. Water scarcity is intimate. It enters kitchens and clinics. It measures the distance between the state's promises and daily life. Protests over inflation or currency are abstract to some. Empty taps are not. The regime's classic toolkit, symbolic mobilization, distributive favors, limited repression, works poorly against a physics problem. No slogan fills a cistern. Thus, Tehran's water crisis is not a subplot to regional politics. It is the plot. It will reorder budgets, reprice risk, and redefine legitimacy inside Iran. It will also sharpen the calculations of adversaries and partners watching for windows, leverage, and spillovers. In the Middle East's new arithmetic of power, the first duty of sovereignty is provision. Where water fails, strategy follows. The crisis of water in Tehran is not confined to households and farms. It extends to the heart of Iran's strategic machinery, its nuclear program. Modern nuclear infrastructure, whether for civilian energy or military capability, is inseparable from reliable access to water and power. In a sense, Iran's nuclear future now depends as much on its aquifers as on its centrifuges. What began as an environmental emergency has evolved into a structural constraint on national ambition. Every stage of Iran's nuclear chain, from uranium milling and conversion to enrichment to reactor operation and cooling, demands stable electricity, chemical purity, and temperature control. Each of these, in turn, depends on water availability. Enrichment facilities like Natanz and Fordo operate with extreme sensitivity to power fluctuations. Even short voltage drops, when compounded by cooling or chemical shortages, can halt production, degrade materials, or trigger safety alerts. Historically, such vulnerabilities were addressed through redundant energy systems. Today, Iran faces grid volatility aggravated by drought. Hydroelectric reservoirs have receded, thermal plants strain under cooling deficits, and diesel backups are rationed. The result is a creeping fragility at the very core of Iran's deterrence narrative. From a purely technical perspective, water scarcity imposes opportunity costs that force trade-offs between strategic and civilian priorities. Every kilowatt diverted to sustain enrichment or reactor cooling is a kilowatt unavailable for pumping water, running hospitals, or keeping Tehran's lights on. The leadership can maintain both only by importing more fuel and parts, an expensive and sanction-constrained proposition. Thus, water becomes a currency of legitimacy. How it is spent reveals whom the regime serves. If the public perceives that scarce resources are being sacrificed for geopolitical prestige, while households endure thirst, anger will grow. Iran's nuclear resolve, once a symbol of national pride, risks transforming into a symbol of misplaced priority. Jeffrey Sachs would interpret this as the paradox of ambition under scarcity. Development and defense normally parallel goals begin to cannibalize each other. A nuclear program sustained through crisis appears not as independence but as obstinacy. The state in this logic becomes hostage to its own narrative of strength. It cannot slow its nuclear pace without appearing weak, yet it cannot accelerate it without inviting domestic backlash and technical strain. This is not deterrence. It is dependency on escalation. Economically, the hydrological constraint adds hidden costs. Industrial production falls as power and water are redirected. Inflation rises. Foreign exchange must be spent on emergency imports of pumps, filters, and coolants. The nuclear sector, highly centralized, politically sacred, absorbs resources that would otherwise stabilize civilian infrastructure. In this sense, the nuclear program operates like a hydromagnet, drawing liquidity, electricity, and legitimacy toward itself while draining the surrounding system. Over time, this imbalance erodes the very state capacity that sustains it. Strategically, water scarcity transforms Iran's external posture. A regime under domestic ecological strain becomes both more risk-averse and more volatile risk-averse in that it must conserve material resources, volatile in that it may externalize pressure through defiance. The temptation grows to manufacture foreign confrontation as a means of internal consolidation to reframe shortages not as administrative failure, but as the consequence of Western aggression. Thus, scarcity feeds narrative utility. Every drought can be blamed on sanctions, every blackout on economic war. Yet this rhetorical leverage cannot refill reservoirs. In the international arena, Iran's hydrological crisis may become an unexpected channel for diplomacy. Global powers, recognizing that water and energy resilience intersect with nuclear safety, could use humanitarian and environmental frameworks to re-engage Tehran. Offers of desalination technology, grid stabilization, or agricultural adaptation could be linked to verification and transparency mechanisms. Sachs would call this hydro diplomacy, using the shared logic of survival to rebuild trust where ideology has failed. It would transform the conversation from one of weapons to one of welfare. Ultimately, Iran's Day Zero is not only a domestic reckoning, it is the silent regulator of its nuclear future. The centrifuge may spin, but the pipes beneath it run dry. And no regime, however determined, can sustain atomic ambition on an empty aquifer. The crisis in Tehran thus reveals a deeper truth of the modern era, that the real limits to power are not imposed by treaties or enemies, but by the earth itself. For Israel, Iran's Day Zero crisis is more than a humanitarian concern. It is a potential strategic inflection point. When the foundations of a rival's domestic stability begin to crumble, the calculus of deterrence shifts. Israel has long regarded Iran's nuclear ambitions as an existential threat, but in the context of a drying Tehran where the struggle for water overtakes even the quest for technological prestige, the equation becomes more complex. Water scarcity weakens Iran materially, yet it also renders the regime more unpredictable. A desperate adversary can be more dangerous than a confident one. Jeffrey Sachs would interpret Israel's response as the politics of opportunity and restraint. On one hand, the crisis presents an opening. Iran's nuclear infrastructure, already constrained by sanctions and internal inefficiency, now faces an additional environmental chokehold. On the other hand, exploiting that vulnerability too overtly could provoke escalation or consolidate Iranian nationalism around a regime fighting for survival. The strategic art, therefore, lies not in confrontation, but in calibration, applying pressure without triggering chaos. From an intelligence standpoint, Israel's agencies will be dissecting every satellite image, every energy flow anomaly, and every signal from Iran's water and power grids. They know that a nuclear program sustained under hydrological strain becomes vulnerable to subtle interference, disruption of supply chains, contamination of inputs, or cyber manipulation of energy distribution. In the lexicon of 21st century deterrence, water scarcity itself becomes a form of soft power leverage, a pressure point to be understood, and, if necessary, Israel's likely objective is to let nature and time erode what sanctions and diplomacy have not. As Tehran diverts scarce electricity to its centrifuges and away from households, the regime's legitimacy will erode faster than its uranium stockpile will grow. This allows Israel to intensify global scrutiny while avoiding open confrontation. Diplomatically, Israeli envoys can frame the issue not as aggression, but as nuclear irresponsibility amid ecological crisis, arguing before Western and Arab partners that an unstable Iran managing a water-starved, heat-stressed nuclear network represents a danger to all. In the corridors of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, strategists understand that environmental fragility can serve as a quiet ally. Iran's domestic focus on survival drains its bandwidth for regional projection, fewer resources for proxy groups, slower logistics through Iraq and Syria, less funding for Hezbollah or Hamas. The drought effectively constrains the very networks Israel has spent years countering militarily. Thus, the rational approach is one of containment, not confrontation, to let structural exhaustion achieve what airstrikes cannot. However, there is also caution. Israeli planners, remember, history cornered regimes act irrationally. Water scarcity may weaken Tehran's infrastructure, but it also concentrates power in the hands of those most willing to use force. The Revolutionary Guard could interpret crisis as justification for external distraction, escalating rhetoric, or regional proxies to shift domestic attention. A dry capital might seek legitimacy through confrontation. For Israel, this is the paradox of victory. Too much pressure risks making the regime unpredictable, too little risks allowing recovery. The larger geopolitical context complicates matters. Moscow, Beijing, and even parts of the global south may use Iran's plight to cast the West as hypocritical, punishing a nation already crippled by climate disaster. Israel must therefore tread carefully in its diplomatic messaging, aligning with environmental realism rather than punitive triumphalism. Sachs would say this is the moral geometry of modern power, the ability to frame strength as stewardship, not domination. There is also the technological dimension. Israel has pioneered desalination, drip irrigation, and advanced water recycling, achieving near water independence in one of the world's driest regions. This gives it both moral credibility and strategic advantage. Quietly through intermediaries or regional institutions, Israeli water technology could be positioned as a stabilizing export. Such diplomacy would not only diffuse tensions, but also reinforce Israel's image as a regional innovator rather than aggressor. Sachs might call this the diplomacy of competence, solving what others weaponize. While the Western world interprets Iran's day zero as a warning of state fragility, Russia and China see an opportunity, an inflection point, where Tehran's desperation can be converted into dependency. For Moscow and Beijing, Iran's crisis is not only humanitarian, it is geopolitical. A weakened but intact Iran serves as both a strategic buffer and a bargaining chip in the larger contest with the West. In this equation, assistance is not aid, it is architecture, the slow construction of a new Eurasian order built on shared survival, sanctioned economies, and mutual defiance. Jeffrey Sachs might call this dynamic the political economy of desperation. When a nation faces collapse, its sovereignty becomes collateral. Russia and China understand this well. Their calculus is not driven by ideology, but by instrumental stability to prevent Iran's failure while ensuring its gratitude remains captive. Moscow and Beijing will not let Tehran fall, but they will also not let it rise independently. In practical terms, the first layer of response is technical triage. Russia can quickly supply diesel generators, water pumps, and small-scale filtration units through military logistics networks that already serve Syria and the Caspian corridor. Moscow's oil and gas infrastructure firms, long accustomed to sanctions, can pivot to sell spare parts for turbines and pipelines disguised as civilian energy equipment. China's role is more structural. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, Beijing can deploy engineering firms and water management technologies, desalination leak detection metering systems under the banner of climate cooperation. Yet the contracts will be denominated in yuan, secured by future Iranian energy flows. What appears as rescue is, in essence, a repegging of Iran's economic future to China's industrial ecosystem. This is hydrodiplomacy with Chinese characteristics, water as entry point, dependence as outcome. Politically, Moscow and Beijing will leverage their support to reframe the narrative. At the United Nations and within the BRICS development forums, they will portray Iran's crisis as evidence of Western hypocrisy, a nation suffocated by sanctions, denied access to climate finance, punished for self-reliance. They will call for a new sovereign resilience initiative, arguing that resource scarcity should be met with humanitarian exemptions from sanctions. Behind the rhetoric lies a sharper ambition to redefine global norms of legitimacy away from the West's liberal order toward a multipolar ethic of non-interference and transactional solidarity. For Russia, the benefits go beyond propaganda. Iran's instability drives oil prices upward, bolstering Moscow's revenues amid its own isolation. It also deepens operational coordination across what Sachs might term the gray alliance, the informal network of sanctioned or semi-sanctioned states, Russia, Iran, Syria, North Korea, Venezuela, that trade survival techniques, barter, settlements, dual-use shipments, digital payment systems, and cyber expertise. In this club of the excluded scarcity becomes common currency. Beijing, more cautious, will avoid open confrontation with the United States over Iran, yet it will quietly expand its presence through energy-backed financing, food exports, and emergency medical aid. Chinese desalination and agriculture companies, often state-linked, can brand their involvement as climate adaptation, masking what is effectively geopolitical encroachment. Over time, these projects will tether Iran's infrastructure, ports, grids, and data systems to Chinese standards, reinforcing the BRI's southern corridor from Pakistan to the Gulf. This convergence, Russian logistics, Chinese capital, Iranian resilience, signals a deeper geopolitical realignment. The axis of survival is emerging as the counterweight to Western sanction regimes. Its logic is transactional rather than ideological. States assist each other not out of shared vision, but out of shared exclusion. Sachs would interpret this as the dark globalization of necessity, a world where crisis no longer invites cooperation across divides, but consolidation within them. Yet beneath the veneer of solidarity lies exploitation. Moscow and Beijing will not solve Iran's water crisis. They will manage it. They will sell solutions that sustain dependency, not independence. Iran, trapped between humiliation and necessity, will accept, and in doing so, surrender fragments of its autonomy. The price of relief will be quiet alignment. At the end of all calculations, nuclear, diplomatic, and military, what remains in Iran's day zero crisis is a single moral truth. No state can claim greatness if it cannot provide water to its people. The drying taps of Tehran are not simply a failure of infrastructure or policy. They are a civilizational mirror, a revelation of how power, when divorced from stewardship, corrodes from within. In this final reckoning, Jeffrey Sachs would argue that the crisis of water is the crisis of governance itself. Across history, great civilizations have risen not merely by conquering territory, but by mastering their relationship with nature. The Romans built aqueducts before empires. The Chinese dynasties constructed canals before armies. The Islamic Golden Age flourished through irrigation, not intimidation. But the modern state, obsessed with power, prestige, and weaponry, has forgotten this ancient lesson that sustainability is sovereignty. In the case of Iran, the pursuit of nuclear capability has overshadowed the duty to secure clean water, fertile soil, and public trust. The day zero moment thus becomes both literal and symbolic, a countdown, not just to environment. Jeffrey Sachs would frame this in terms of the moral economy of survival. A government's legitimacy no longer rests on ideology or arms, but on its ability to sustain life. Water, electricity, food, and health have become the new front lines of global politics. In this sense, Iran's crisis is not unique. From the Colorado River Basin to the Mekong Delta, from North Africa to Central Asia, societies are learning that scarcity is the new currency of power. The question is not who controls weapons, but who controls the means of resilience. The tragedy, Sachs would say, is that the world continues to treat water as a domestic utility rather than a global security system. Just as nuclear treaties emerged after Hiroshima, so too should a planetary framework for hydrological security emerge from Tehran's drought. Yet instead of cooperation, what we see is fragmentation, nations hoarding technology, weaponizing resources, and turning climate stress into geopolitical leverage. The Middle East, once the cradle of irrigation civilization, has become the front line of its collapse. Still within this darkness, there remains the possibility of moral renewal, what Sachs calls the pivot from power to provision. Iran, despite its isolation, could transform its greatest vulnerability into its greatest source of legitimacy. A national water rescue plan built around transparency, regional cooperation, and green diplomacy could rebuild credibility faster than any nuclear negotiation. Imagine Tehran hosting a Middle Eastern water security summit instead of another weapons parade. Imagine Iranian scientists working with Gulf and Israeli engineers on shared desalination systems. Imagine the Revolutionary Guard redefined not as an army of fear, but as an army of restoration. Such shifts may seem utopian, yet history is moved not by cynics, but by those who reimagine necessity as opportunity. At the global level, Sachs would urge the creation of a water non-proliferation framework, an idea as bold as the nuclear treaties of the 20th century. Just as nations agreed that the spread of atomic weapons threatened humanity, they must now recognize that the depletion of fresh water threatens civilization. The right to water, like the right to peace, should be treated as inviolable. Climate finance, technology transfer, and sanctions policy must be restructured around this principle. Denying a nation access to desalination, membranes, or power infrastructure in the name of punishment is not policy, it is slow violence. Yet Sachs would not absolve Iran's leadership. The crisis is self-inflicted as much as imposed. Decades of over-extraction, mismanagement, and political pride have brought the nation to this point. True sovereignty begins with humility, the recognition that governance is a moral covenant between state and nature. To govern is not to dominate, but to sustain. In the end, the drought in Tehran is not just Iran's reckoning, it is humanity's preview. The 21st century will not be defined by ideological blocks, but by ecological survival. The old hierarchies of military and finance will give way to a new order of resilience. Those who manage the biosphere will govern the future. In this sense, Sachs might conclude the real superpower of our age is not America, Russia, or China. It is the Earth itself demanding that we either learn to live within its limits or perish by our arrogance. Water, Sachs would say, is the first democracy. It flows to all or to none. When it stops flowing, civilization itself begins to die. The moral horizon is therefore clear Iran's day. Zero is not only a warning to its rulers, but a lesson to us all. The age of domination is ending. The age of stewardship has begun. Those who fail to understand this will not merely lose power, they will lose the planet.